Our CBS Mornings anchor Tony Dokoupil is in Iowa and spoke yesterday to former Governor Nikki Haley.
Iowans sometimes make their decision very late.
Yes.
This is still an open ball game.
Yes.
What's your closing argument to them?
Yeah, I mean, the closing argument is, let's get rid of the chaos. Let's leave the old names of the past and let's move forward with a new conservative leader that's going to get our country back on track. We can't go through 4 more years of chaos. We can't go through Trump or Biden anymore. Everybody, 75% of America has said they don't want a Trump-Biden rematch. So I think we need to go forward and give them something else. And that's what we're trying to do, is give them a new option.
I've been talking to voters for the past 2 weekends, and a lot of voters like you very much.
Yay.
But they say they're hoping you'll be a VP this time around. A VP to you-know-who. How do you feel about that?
I don't play for second. I've never played for second. I'm not going to start now. I'm not interested in being vice president. I'm running to be president, and I'm running to win, and we will.
What's your message to those voters in particular who like you enough to be VP, but right now are still stuck on Donald Trump?
Well, I think, look, if you want 4 more years of chaos, that's what you're going to get. But what's more concerning is, if you look at those head-to-head polls, Trump and Biden are pretty much even. It's going to be a nail-biter of an election. We're going to be holding our breath. I don't want a President Kamala Harris.
To talk more about the state of the contest, we turn to our CBS News political team in Iowa, Ed O'Keefe, Robert Costa, and Major Garrett. They're at GOP headquarters in Des Moines, and Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report is here with me in studio. Ed, I want to start with you. What's driving the decision of these Republican voters in Iowa?
Well, Margaret, happy Sunday to you. If you talk to Trump voters, they reflect back the anger, the resentment, the desire for payback that the former president continues to reflect on the trail, most especially concerned about issues like border security, the future of immigration policy in this country, and the cost of things, inflation, reflecting back to us that they're concerned about gas prices, even though they're starting to come down, but also being able to own a home or even affordably rent an apartment. You talk to Ron DeSantis' supporters, they generally agree with those views, but in the back of their minds, they know that Donald Trump can't necessarily win a general election, so they're looking for someone else who can do that. Whether or not there are enough of those people here in Iowa is the big question for the Florida governor. And I've been most struck by Nikki Haley's supporters who reflect back what we're seeing in the polling this morning. They're not angry. They're concerned about the future of the world, concerned that the president is allowing things in Ukraine and the Middle East and Asia to spiral out of control. They're concerned that Washington is needlessly spending money. In a word, they're concerned about the chaos, which is the word she uses so frequently as she did there in her conversation with Tony, and one that appears to be resonating here in the last few hours.
Bob Costa, I know you were in court earlier in the week with Mr. Trump, and our polling shows those legal issues are a net positive for him with voters. Is the Trump campaign banking on that?
Margaret, good to be with you. Usually in the closing stretch of the Iowa caucuses, there's an ideological debate inside the Republican Party, a standoff over the future of the GOP. But instead, we're seeing this explosion of grievance among Trump supporters. And inside the high command of the Trump campaign, they're playing to that. And when I spoke to former President Trump in recent days in Lower Manhattan, I said, how do you see the campaign versus the courtroom? And he said, Bob, the campaign is the courtroom. He will keep making these appearances, playing to his supporters and saying that he is with them. He's standing against an establishment he perceives as the enemy, and that he hopes, and his officials hope, will fuel his campaign in the coming weeks and, if he makes it, to the general election.
Major Garrett, you've covered a number of campaigns, and the adage from pundits is always, oh, national security doesn't really matter to voters. But I want you to listen to something Donald Trump was asked last night in Iowa.
The world is in chaos. What happened with Yemen and the missile strikes the last few days, Ukraine, Palestine, we don't even know where the Secretary of Defense is right now. Are we on the brink of World War III?
I think we're the closest that we've ever been. And, you know, Joe, this won't be a regular war. This is not going to be, as I say, army tanks running back and forth, shooting each other. These are weapons of mass destruction, the likes of which nobody's ever seen. I've seen them. And this is obliteration. This is not a world war like we are used to. World War I, World War II were terrible, horrible. This is so much bigger than that. This is, you know, like annihilation.
I've seen him. Major Garrett, sounds like Trump is saying, I alone can fix it.
So I've been covering Donald Trump since 2015, and my conversations way back then, Margaret, reminded me of something that he's always possessed a fear and a fascination about nuclear weapons and nuclear war, a constant obsession with his, how to avoid it. So that's one part of that answer. It's a legitimate one. Most American presidents in the nuclear age have felt that as well. But Trump is acutely fascinated by it and fearful of it. That's one of the reasons he began those negotiations, though unsuccessful, with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. But this is also an answer about a larger context in American political life. If you're not a Trump supporter, are you anxious about the future? Do you believe a re-elected President Biden would be strong enough, fit enough, courageous enough to handle an unstable world? Trump is answering that. No, he won't. I will be. You may not like me, but I will be strong and I will be vigorous. That's one of the messages he's trying to convey with that annihilation answer.
I mean, it's just chilling, Amy, to hear some of the language that we are talking about being normalized on the campaign trail. You said earlier this week it's kind of hard to get excited about Iowa in a contest where the frontrunner is ahead by just so much. Is this just a glide path to Donald Trump securing the nomination of the party?
Well, given the numbers that you all put out today, it sure looks that way, and every poll that we've seen out of Iowa suggests that as well. With the one road bump in the way being New Hampshire, in part because the New Hampshire electorate looks so different from Iowa's and then from the next state that has significant primary, which is South Carolina. There you have, in those two states, more evangelical, more conservative Republican. New Hampshire, more independent voters. That's the Nikki Haley voter right there in New Hampshire. So you can see her do well in a state like New Hampshire, but that's not going to give her the sort of momentum to go into a place like South Carolina that is going to look much more like what we're seeing in Iowa.
Despite it being her home state.
Despite it being her home state, it is still where Donald Trump has a great deep well of support. And I think the fascinating thing, when you look back, thinking about where we were at this point in 2020, and the debate on the Democratic side was all about who could beat Donald Trump.
Right.
And that's how, even though he lost those first couple of contests, Joe Biden was able to come back and win because he was seen as the most electable. It is very clear who the most electable candidate is in every poll, not just the CBS poll, and that's Nikki Haley. And that has done her no good, in part because Republican base believes that Trump is going to win anyway, that he won the last time around. Yeah. And when it's that close, which it was in 2020, it's just going to take a few thousand more votes to put it in Trump's direction.
Ed O'Keefe, you cover the Biden White House. Does the Biden campaign believe they have a problem?
Not yet necessarily, Margaret. They, like our polling, like just about everyone else that's monitoring this closely, believe that when all is said and done, former President Trump will be the Republican nominee. And they look at these numbers that continue to suggest that Nikki Haley's more electable and ask the question, at least some of them do, well, okay, let's say she's the nominee. Where's Donald Trump at that point? What is he doing to help her or potentially hurt her by raising concerns? He would splinter the party, they believe. Ultimately, however, they are of the belief that most Americans, despite those that loyally watch us here on Face the Nation, aren't necessarily paying attention to this yet, don't believe that Donald Trump will ultimately prevail. It looks like he might, and once that binary choice is before the American people again, the White House believes they'll be able to win it. But they caution, it's not about today. Polling today doesn't matter. It's the polling next fall, and on Election Day, they are only going to be concerned about going forward.
Major Garrett, what would a second Trump presidency look like?
Well, I guess the underlying part of your question, Margaret, is would it be a threat to democracy? That's certainly something the president's, that is to say President Biden's campaign, has leaned very much into in the last week. The bigger question for the country is, do we have a common definition of the future of democracy? And our polling and everyone else's polling, but particularly our polling, suggests Republicans are now defining democracy and its orientation to Trump quite differently than the rest of the country. We've talked about this rallying effect, this idea that prosecutors are somehow being too vigorous with former President Trump, whatever his underlying conduct was. Republicans have been rallying and moving in that direction consistently since January 6th. They're hardening around support of Trump, seeing his grievances as their grievances. And when Trump talks about retribution and doing something on behalf of himself and not the American democratic experiment, Republicans are rallying to that. So in that context, Margaret, democracy, constitutional republic, all our traditions and all our institutions seem to me and feel more threatened if there's a Trump re-election. That's a conjecture, but it is not a conjecture in the dark. It's a conjecture that aligns perfectly with our polling and everyone else's.
So, Bob, if this isn't a traditional campaign, what do we need to expect from the candidates in terms of what they're actually going to be able to do to secure the nomination?
Look for Trump to try to assert himself as someone who's comfortable with power and wants a revival. Back in 2016, many of his allies told me he stumbled into the presidency. Now, years later, they say he's ready to use executive power in a sweeping way, mass deportations, shake up U.S. foreign policy. This election is shaping up to be a reckoning on American democracy and what a Trump return to the White House would say about the United States. But so many of Trump's rivals at this point are just not ready to wade into those waters. They're trying to stick to their talking points, and we'll see if that's enough for them to catch up.
Gentlemen, thank you for joining us from Iowa. Amy Walter, thank you.